Well, hello to everybody from the Asia Scotland Institute. My name's Roddy Gow. I'm the founder and chairman. And our mission is to educate and inspire tomorrow's leaders, particularly in Scotland, and to increase people's understanding of what is going on in Pan-Asia. And we focus on business and economics, policy and politics, and arts, culture, and education. And it's in the sort of business and the cultural aspect of that's what we're going to focus on this morning. And I'm absolutely delighted that we're joined by Shoshana Stewart, who is one of the founder and person who really is responsible for the building of a most remarkable initiative known as Turquoise Mountain, starting in Kabul in Afghanistan, now working in Myanmar and elsewhere. And this has everything to do with creating a sustainable economy for these countries and for reviving the sometimes lost arts of artisans and craftsmen, and at the same time doing other things that relate to that in the fields of education, healthcare, and the restoration of buildings. So Sharon, I wonder if you could in a second start us off. Also on this call we have April Gow, who is a member of the International Advisory Council of the Asia Scotland Institute, Elizabeth Linder, who is a board member, and Doug Cook, who is the Institute Director. So welcome to all of you, and Shoshana, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. This is wonderful to talk to everyone, and in particular because we are really Scottish born, because we were created by the Prince of Wales and set up and created by Rory Stewart, my husband. And so for a very, very long time, our central office was in Perthshire because everything was in Afghanistan. We have always been a Scottish registered charity. So it's wonderful to talk to you all. And also because Roddy and April have been incredible friends to Turquoise Mountain for many years, April in particular, working very closely. So wonderful to see you all, and thank you for having me. What I thought I'd do is just take you through the story of Turquoise Mountain. So 2006, we were set up, an idea by the Prince of Wales and the Afghan president then, President Karzai, as I mentioned, to do two things in Afghanistan. One was to preserve the old city of Kabul, the historic old city, and the other was to try to save the Afghan traditional craft industry from disappearing after, at that point, sort of 30 and now well over 40 years of conflict. There was so much that was gone or on its last leg. So we had these dual purposes, the old city and crafts. And we began here in the heart of the old city called Murad Khani. It's a neighborhood that's right on the banks of the Kabul River. And it was a place of incredible historic courtyard buildings, traditional crafts. But when we began, the streets were 6 feet deep in garbage. And so we just started digging. We just started cleaning, wheelbarrows and shovels. You know, these were very narrow alleyways, so we didn't have any heavy machinery. It was just everyone in the community digging. Cleared the garbage and then began restoring the building. So this is a before and after picture, and another before and after. And we've restored over 150 of these buildings. We also put in water supply, sanitation, electricity, and stone paving down every street to every house. And we trained about 4,000 builders over the course of all these restorations. And there they are in the middle of Great Sarai. And then there were things that we didn't expect. I mean, we had never expected at the beginning to get into primary health and primary education, but this community of about 700 people, you know, no one was going to doctors, no one was going to school. It was rated in 2016 in the surveys of Kabul as the 4th poorest neighborhood in the city, which is, you know, already a pretty low bar in terms of the world. And so it was it was just a place not accessing any services, basically. So we did what we needed to do. We set up literacy programs and referral services, and they grew and grew. And now we have a primary school that serves all the boys and girls in the area, half and half. And a health clinic that has seen over 120,000 patients, about 70% of whom are women and girls, because it focuses on maternal child health. There are all the kids from the primary school and all their families on New Year's Day. We always have a big celebration on now. And, you know, these are 3 girls who have just finished at the primary school. And I remember the twins. They're obviously very, very noticeable, so we do remember them. But I remember the twins when they were little babies, sort of just beginning to walk. So this is really a community that we have lived with and alongside for many years. So that was Moored Honey. That's the building restoration and the community in the Old City area. And at the same time, we're working on traditional crafts. So this is embodied in Abdul Hadi. Abdul Hadi was the great lattice woodworker of Afghanistan. I mean, he worked for the king. He was a famous man. People knew his name. But when we met him, he was in his 70s and hadn't produced in 15 years. He was selling fruit in the bazaar. This is how a tradition dies away, because he didn't pass it on. And so we rounded up all of these retired craft masters and brought them out of retirement and built a school around them. So we put young Afghan men and women into this institute and began training across 4 schools: calligraphy and miniature painting, jewelry and gem cutting, ceramics, and woodworking. So Abdul Hadi was the great master woodworker in that department. Then we realized that the training was great, but it didn't matter if they couldn't sell what they made. And I don't mean in a sort of grand development sense, in a very, very real sense. These are individuals who are not going to spend 3 years. It's a 3-year course. I mean, you had to develop mastery. You have to be serious about it for many years. They're not going to spend 3 years of their life to graduate and not really be able to sell anything. It just makes absolutely no sense. No one would come. So we began trying to sell what they made in a very amateur way around Kabul in the beginning, to the embassies and the wealthier Afghan elite. But we realized that Afghanistan was never going to win a race to the bottom. In other words, this is not a low-cost producer. And so these had to be instead high value, high design standard for international export. It's really about finding ways to sell to Dubai, to New York, to Japan. And so our first big commission was to a 5-star hotel in the heart of London, the Connaught Hotel. So we made this entire suite of Afghan woodwork entirely in Afghanistan, all the windows, the doors, the bed. That showed us actually what hotels can do, because they both operate at quite a high standard if it's a 5-star hotel, but also they have a relatively large volume because they have many rooms. So that suite was led by Ustad Nasser, who is now Afghanistan's greatest woodworker and worked very closely with Abdul Hadi for years. And Khadija, who's another graduate of the Institute, was a student and then worked for Nasser. And then if you fast forward a few years, as I said, hotels became very important to us. Our biggest commission at that time was for a 5-star hotel in Mecca in Saudi Arabia. And obviously for our Afghan artisans to work for something that was 50 feet away from Mecca, from the Haram, was a particular honor and was also a huge economic boost because it was a $500,000 commission. So it was calligraphy and miniature painting, ceramics and woodwork. And Samira is an example of what this looks like when it all comes together. So Samira, I met her when she was 19, when she started at the Institute. She graduated 3 years later at the exact same time that we were getting this commission. And over the course of that year, she went from, 22-year-old with a degree in calligraphy, and she was the most skilled in her class. So she was incredibly skilled, but she didn't have anything else behind that. She went from that to being the Afghan Female Entrepreneur of the Year later that year. She built a $150,000 business that year, employing 30 of her fellow graduates and teachers, getting all of this calligraphy to Mecca. So that's how this works, is when you have not only the transmission of skills to Samira as the younger generation, but that she's able to make a living for herself, be an ambassador for Afghan traditions around the world, but also create jobs for 30 other people. That's sort of how this works at its best form. And finally, in Afghanistan, we, a few years ago, began to get into carpets. And I say that because carpets is something that Afghanistan has always done and has always done very well. So to some extent, we weren't as worried about it. But actually, if you look at carpet production around the world, what is needed and what will be the future is about fair trade. People want not only a high design standard, and they want contemporary carpets as well as traditional. They want to be able to design them and say what they look like. But they want to make sure that there are not children on looms, that people are not being poisoned by toxic dyes. And so our purpose in the Afghan carpet industry is not to train a new generation of weavers. There are hundreds of thousands of weavers around Afghanistan. That's not what's needed. What's needed is to make sure that they can actually get their product to the global carpet industry. Because if they can't, it will disappear over the course of a generation. The big producers in carpets are Nepal, India, Iran, has always been Turkey. But Turkey and Iran are really not producing. So there's a huge gulf left there, which Afghanistan can fill. So we sit there working with thousands of weavers around the country, making sure that they get the commissions, but that they produce to standard, that their working conditions are good, their wages are good, wages are handed directly to the women who are actually weaving, they're getting support services, and that the design standards are high and the natural dyes, color fast, all the rest. So that's the Afghan carpet industry, and a really important part of what Afghanistan is now for us, because it's such a huge part of the Afghan economy. So that's Afghanistan, which remains our biggest and first and most important project. But in 2015, we decided that we were going to say yes to a request, basically, for us to do this in Myanmar. Obviously, a totally different context, and for us, that really matters and mattered, because the only reason that we were any good in Afghanistan is we were all in Afghanistan. We all, 98% of our staff has always been Afghan. I lived in Afghanistan. I learned to speak Dari, albeit very badly, but knowing where we were and being there, living there was everything. So how do you do this in a different place? And that's always continues to be an important thing, that it has to be adapted in such a serious way. There's nothing cookie cutter about cultural projects, I don't think, at least not about ours. So what does it look like in Myanmar? It is, again, about buildings and crafts. This is the large building that we finished last year. It's called the Tourist Burma Building. This is before and after. And incredible tile floors that were all restored. We trained over 800 people on the building, plaster work on the facade there. So this is the interior, which is just totally, totally derelict. And this is one of 30 huge former colonial buildings that are owned by the government, but the government is really not going to be able to do anything with them. So they sit there empty. So we wanted to demonstrate, we wanted to train a lot of people, we wanted to save a building, but we also wanted to demonstrate how you could make this cultural building, and relic is what it felt like, into an asset, that you can actually use this for tourism. You can actually enhance the value of the property and not just knock it down and build some weird sort of commercial apartments in the center of the city. So this is a before picture of the inside and after. And so that building is now a center where cultural programming is ongoing and working very well. And then on the craft side of things, jewelry was one of the first and best things that we do there, because the goldsmithing is absolutely incredible, really, really wonderful. Most of it's done in Rakhine. So most of our goldsmiths are from Rakhine. And we have our own workshop. Lacquerware, obviously very, very important in many countries in Asia and Myanmar in particular. And then textiles. And textiles is very, very important to the Myanmar economy, in a way that's analogous with carpets in Afghanistan. What I mean by that is that many of these crafts, we're talking about hundreds and thousands of people that will do it. And we do it because we want it to exist in the world, because we believe that culturally these are important assets for the world and for those individual countries and cultures and groups. And it's a great way to develop good, sustainable incomes. Some of these, though, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people and major drivers of the economy. And in the case of Myanmar textiles and Afghan carpets, that's really, really true. So in textiles, you have different traditions very intact around Myanmar, in Shan, in Chin, in Kachin, in Rakhine. And so we are, again, making sure that these are fair trade, high value, naturally dyed, high design standard products. And in Myanmar, that's potentially even more important, because Myanmar does have the structures, I suppose, to be potentially a low-cost producer, which is just them moving into a sort of sweatshop industry. I mean, incredibly low wage, very bad conditions, and they possibly can do it. So there will be elements of that. So as the Myanmar economy continues to open up to the world, we are here to pivot at the moment that they can, when they still have the traditions totally intact, to pivot toward that higher value, sustainable proposition away from the low value, low cost. And so we're doing it. I mean, we're supplying for the Rosewood, the Peninsula Hotels, Holt Renfrew, the big Canadian department store in New York and London. They can't get enough of it. And there's a reason for that, which is that it's it's hand woven patterns, and very few people actually make that around the world now. People print patterns and people hand weave fabric, but they don't hand weave patterns often. So it's a very, very unique and special thing. And they have all the materials there. It's silk, it's cotton, it's lotus. They actually make a fabric from lotus flower. It's a lot like linen, but really, really wonderful potential for that in Myanmar. So that is our Myanmar project. And on to Jordan, and on this I will end, and then we can go into some conversation. So our most recent projects are across the Middle East, and we're working both in Saudi Arabia with mostly women across the kingdom, and in Jordan. And Jordan, I feel like, has two pieces to it. One is that it has millions of refugees, Palestinian refugees, a generation, and now over 1 million Syrian refugees. And obviously the level of devastation of Syrian life and craft and culture is extraordinary, and monuments. But Jordan itself is such a beautiful, just a breathtaking country. And the pictures on the right are, of course, in Jordan, and both the overlays of different types of architecture and archaeology, but also just olive trees. And it is an extraordinarily beautiful place in the middle of so much difficulty. And the generosity of spirit and the strength that they display is just unreal. I mean, they have housed this generation of Palestinians, a generation of Syrians, and they do it with such grace. And so while the reason that we went to Jordan was about trying to preserve and transmit Syrian culture through this conflict, actually, it is so much more than that. It is about people who live in Jordan and were born in Jordan, in Syria, in Palestine, in Egypt, in Iraq. And this is a place where they are all coming together and working and trying to bring forward and keep the places they came from. So that's Jordan. This is Mustafa, who is from Syria, and he is a wonderful metal worker. So metalwork, copper and brass, has been an important part of this. Also, obviously, the incredible mother of pearl inlay that's famous in Syria. This is Maher, who is a carpenter and joiner. And I've really noticed the difference between Syrian woodworkers and Afghan woodworkers. In the case of Afghan woodworkers, they hadn't produced in decades. And Abdul Hadi, he had everything in his head, but his hand was shaking. He wasn't really in a position to be running a workshop. It needed to be a blend of people coming in to fix the joinery and younger people taking over. In the case of our Syrian woodworkers, Maher is in his late 30s. He was running over $1 million business in Damascus a few years ago when he left. He's at the top of his game, if you will. And he then moves to Jordan and has nothing. He's in the back of a Jordanian guy's apartment. I mean, there's his capability, his connections to market, well, I should say his capability is everything. His connections to market stop on a dime, but he's ready to go immediately. And his hunger for creating and innovating is very, very strong. So that's been amazing. So, for example, we've immediately, reestablished Maher's workshop and put apprentices underneath him. And this is one of his first apprentices, Ahmed. And Ahmed, we paid for him as an apprentice, and then we got commissions from Maher, and those things happened simultaneously. So Maher's able to grow his business and actually hire Ahmed. And the first day Ahmed was there, Maher broke down into tears because we hadn't realized how much that would matter, because he said, this entire part of me, which is teaching, has been totally absent for 7 years. So it is wonderful to see the artisans not just practicing what they're doing, but bring the whole thing, the whole life back to life of what it means to be an artisan. So they make these things for international export, but also for sale in Amman, in Jordan, because actually a huge part of the Jordanian economy is tourism, and it's a place where people buy beautiful products. They're Jordanian, they're foreign. And so we actually have a serious trade done in Amman. This is our showroom. This is a mosaic table made by Abu Abdu, who is from Damascus. Incredible inlay. That's him in the upper left, and a more modern table that he's made on the right, all different inlaid woods. And then we do a project in mostly in Zatri and Azraq refugee camps, but we've done it outside as well, which is basically a cultural course for young children just to connect them back to home, to Syria. And so I think I'll end on that. We can talk more about how all of these artisans come together to produce products for international markets as a mixture of different traditions, but that's us.
Shoshana, thank you so much. It's an inspiring story, and if you like, these individual craftsmen like Ahmed and others are a sort of microcosm of what you've achieved on a larger scale. And I'd like to hand over to April now, who will start off with some questions, and then we'll move to Elizabeth. April.
Shoshana, the story of Turquoise Mountain is so extraordinary, and I always love to think about Turquoise Mountain as being the great success story to come out of now 20 years of war, but really 40 years of war, if you consider going back to the time when the Russians invaded Afghanistan. But it's an extraordinary achievement, and bravo. And it was the story of how the Prince of Wales and Karzai sort of hatched the idea, I think is worth mentioning. You know, and also how the Prince of Wales had the idea about Myanmar, I think, and open connections for Turquoise Mountain to go in at the time when the generals released control and Aung San Suu Kyi was elected. And then there's another point, I think, that was a big inflection point, and that's when, as I recall, the Museum of Islamic Art commissioned Turquoise Mountain artisans in Kabul to mount an exhibition, and that really put Turquoise Mountain on the map and led to the Freer Sackler, and then the time when you were at the World Economic Forum, Davos, and that kind of thing. Maybe you could just touch on those areas too, because I think that those parts of the story are so incredible.
Absolutely. Thank you, April. And you've known us through all of that time, so it is always exciting to talk to you about the origins, which I lose track of as I look forward. So yes, we were created out of that first conversation with the Prince of Wales and President Karzai, because the Prince of Wales created this extraordinary institution called the School for Traditional Arts, which has always been in London and a part in Scotland, which trains people in traditional arts and heavy emphasis on Islamic art. And it's at the highest level you can imagine. And I mean, it's extraordinary stuff. And he was bringing Karzai around, showing him. And President Karzai basically said, this is so wonderful, but I'm very sad because we have these extraordinary traditions in Afghanistan, and we don't have an institution like this that actively teaches young people how to do it, and we're going to lose it. And so they sort of asked Rory, who had walked across Afghanistan in the winter of 2001, 2002, just after the Taliban fell, and written a book about it as part of a 2-year walk across parts of Asia. But Rory knew bits about Afghanistan, so they sent him out to see what he could do. And he really came up with this expanded idea. But it was really just out of that conversation. But, you know, it's quite a lot of how our new projects start, which is just serendipity, opportunity. You know, many things don't come to fruition, but a lot of them do come from just sparks of ideas. And so the Museum of Islamic Art in Doha, you know, inevitably another one like that. But this is, you know, the Qataris have an extraordinary collection of Islamic art, and they decided they were going to mount their first homemade exhibition. You know, they had built this extraordinary IMP building out over the water in Doha in Qatar, and they wanted to create their first exhibition that they were going to travel. So they asked us to partner with them, and so what they did was fly 30 of our artisans to Doha and put them in the vaults of the museum for 2 weeks in blue plastic gloves, which we're now all very familiar with, to be with these historic objects. And for these young Afghans, you know, they may be the inheritors of extraordinary Afghan traditions, but their exposure to wider Islamic arts and monuments was almost zero. They're not taught it in school. I mean, many of them hadn't been to school. And so for them to actually sit there with these, you know, these ruby and emerald encrusted Mughal daggers and these extraordinary miniature paintings, they were humbled in a way that I have never seen Afghans humbled before, because it's one of their great strengths is they basically, in most of my experience, believe that they have the greatest civilization on earth. And of course, everyone wants to come and see it. So there is this wonderful pride. But for the first time, all of these young people, and actually the masters, were just humbled by what had been produced centuries before them. And so then they were charged with, over 6 months, creating pieces inspired by these historic pieces. And so not copies, but for example, that dagger actually, Humaira, who's a great miniature painter, decided to create her own miniature painting with a story around the dagger, and so brought that piece back to life. And so that was the exhibition, which was 30 pairings of a piece from the museum's collection and a piece made by Afghan artisans today, and the story of how it was created. And then we traveled that to London, to Leighton House. So that was it's just an incredible platform for them to be able not only to interact with historic objects and to create, but also to be in this extraordinary museum. And then, as you said, April, and actually you were there in that first meeting with me, with the Smithsonian. You know, we aren't a museum, so I have no business going around pitching exhibitions. But we met someone from the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, from the Freer Sackler, and really I just showed them pictures of what we were doing in Afghanistan, including what we'd just done at the Museum of Islamic Art. What you all just saw to some extent, and they said, actually, we'd love you to show this to the director because I think he might be interested. And the reason that was, and the reason it worked, was that Julian Raby, who was the director of the Freer Sackler for many years, wanted to show a different kind of exhibition. You know, he would say, had one of the greatest collections of Islamic and Asian art in the world that people didn't come and see, you know, that could have been seen so much more because it's behind glass boxes, and actually wanted to create an exhibition that wasn't about objects in boxes, but was about people and places and processes, about stories. And I guess he saw in us an opportunity to do that. So what we did was took over the entire ground floor basement of the Sackler and sort of rebuilt the old city down there. It was a journey through the story of Turquoise Mountain and through the revival of these traditions. So you had 5 bits to it, and you were meant to touch everything and interact with it, and the artisans were there. There was calligraphy and painting, there was woodworking, there was carpets, there was ceramics, and there was jewelry making. And each of them was not a spectacular piece just sat in a box. It was, in fact, in the case of carpets, you had the yarn, you had the dye, so you'd piles of different spices and different bits of ground pomegranate that made this coloring. And you had huge videos that showed the process of making these things. So we made that exhibition, and it was meant to be on for about 9 months. And it ended up being the most popular exhibition that they'd had in 5 years. You know, we had over 500,000 Americans come to see it, and visitors, of course. And this was, you know, I think Julian was right that people want to interact. They want to know the people behind things. And that was, but also, you know, so that it was a great exhibition. It worked well, but it also, I think, showed that people do really want to connect across cultures, and they're interested in who Saida is and where these emeralds come from, and her journey through a refugee camp in Pakistan and back to Kabul. And finally, just what you ended on, April, that exhibition did very well. And so we then partnered with the Smithsonian to bring that to the World Economic Forum in Davos. We were the cultural exhibit there in, was it 2018? And then traveled to Buckingham Palace and put this exhibit on there.
Brilliant.
That was part of the summer exhibition. Yeah. It's amazing. Or Prince of Wales' 70th birthday, wasn't it? His
exactly.
That was his.
Yeah, for his 70th birthday, they put on a summer exhibition in Buckingham Palace called Prince and Patron, and it really was about his life's work and those things that he has been the patron of, but that he really created. And so it was elements of us, of the Prince's School of Traditional Arts, and some others.
Wonderful. What a wonderful story. And I'm going to turn now to Elizabeth to perhaps ask a few questions about where the future lies and where Turquoise Mountain goes next. But over to you, Elizabeth.
Yes, absolutely. Well, Shoshana, thank you so much. I've heard so much from April about Turquoise Mountain, but never from you directly presenting your story. And so it was a real pleasure to hear that. As Ronnie mentioned, I serve on the board of the Asia Scotland Institute and have from the very beginning. I also have the pleasure of serving as the executive director of Beautiful Destinations in the travel and tourism industry. And of course, one of the most exciting components of travel and tourism when we get it right is the ability to really showcase and help the positive economic impact of the places that are being toured and of the people who are being visited, so that industry enhances not only a global ecosystem, but also a very local one. And that, of course, as we know, is so important for the people in local environments who are part of these destinations. One of the ones that I find really interesting at the moment is many of us are very well aware that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has placed tourism as one of its big initiatives leading up to 2030. And in the northern county of Alula, we see a huge focus not only on developing the tourism ecosystem there, but also on ensuring the upskilling of locals, so that locals also within the community will benefit from what we anticipate will be a huge growth of tourism in that area. And I know that you have worked a bit in Saudi Arabia and with Alula specifically, and I would just so love to hear about what the future of that holds and what the future of your thinking about how it is that these skills can directly relate into the future of travel and tourism and local economic development, how you see that moving forward in the future.
Absolutely. No, I'm glad you raised it, because I didn't get to talk enough about Saudi Arabia in my presentation. But no, Al-Ula is the most extraordinary site, and for those who don't know about it, it houses a set of ruins called Madan Saleh, which I was very lucky enough to go to about 7 years ago, which is, I mean, it's unfair to just compare it to Petra, because it is in many ways equal to, if not, I mean, it's completely untouched, but also part of that Nabatean kingdom. So basically there's another Petra sitting in Saudi Arabia, and they are opening it up to tourism. So it's genuinely it's a UNESCO heritage site. It's genuinely a world leading site and a treasure. But so all the more reason that we must do it right. And what I mean by that is that we must do everything from protecting the heritage and making it accessible, but caring for the community that cares for it and that to whom it belongs in a sort of geographic sense. So yeah, completely agree with you, and the question is really important how you do that. So we have been working in Saudi Arabia since 2015 or 16, and that is about working with hundreds of women, mostly, some men, across the kingdom in Saudi tradition. This is Hanan Rawas, who is a woman from Jeddah, and she is part of a collective of 16 women who have learned from the beginning, they did not know this before, gypsum plaster carving. So Jeddah is another UNESCO heritage site in Saudi Arabia, and it has the most extraordinary coral and wood buildings. And part of that is decorative plaster work. And so they make these plaster panels both for buildings and for decoration. And, you know, they're delivering $100,000 order right now for the Marriott. And there's huge business for this inside Saudi Arabia. And so to produce traditional handmade pieces in Saudi Arabia for Saudi Arabian market is a massive opportunity, I suppose, for these artisans, but it has to be up to standard. So again, that's where we come in, is that there is quite a lot of very low quality stuff made in any country, but it is definitely true in Saudi Arabia. And so we are just there to do that, you know, really up the level of these things. So that's Hanan doing plaster work. And actually there she is at Davos, at the World Economic Forum, at that exhibition. This is Sedu, which is very, very beautiful, naturally dyed closed knot weaving from Qasim region of Saudi Arabia. This is an amazing type of painting, which is actually on the UNESCO list of intangible cultural heritage. It's interior wall painting, and you can see it on the bottom left. It's called Qat. And the houses in this region, in Abha, are just, you know, mind-blowingly brilliant. And these very unique, I mean, where else do you see that in the world? You might, you know, it shares some elements with Mexican art, but it's the most extraordinary stuff. And when we first started, a lot of people in Saudi Arabia didn't recognize it. They didn't see it. And now people really are from all over the world, because it's gotten quite a lot of press claiming it and saying, yes, this is our Qat art. And so you're seeing such an interest and a resurgence. So I think that in Saudi Arabia, there's a real hunger for culture and for tradition, and for their culture and tradition, saying this is ours and we do it beautifully, not this is what I can buy in from somewhere else, and not I paid a ton of money for it, but that this is ours. So I think the hunger is there. There's obviously quite a lot of money around, and so that can sometimes be bad for preserving things well. And so if we look then at Al-Ula, I want to make sure that we are training artisans there to produce pieces that can go into buildings, pieces that can be sold as for tourism, for fashion, but that has elements of the traditional, respects the heritage, tells the story, and is of a high quality. And that's really the difficulty. This is some of the woodwork from Jeddah. This is woodwork from Qasim. This is Ahmed. I'll end on Ahmed, because this is the question that you originally asked, which is about the people and the community, right? So we need to make sure that we match the buyers up with a product that actually respects Saudi heritage and employs Saudis and Saudi women in particular to make these things. But there's everything else around that. It's not just about the products. It's also about making sure they have what they need to make their lives good. You know, in Afghanistan, that was about primary health and education. In Jordan, it's about, in the camps, about a connection to home. With our artisans more widely, it's about mental health, because everyone is on prescribed antidepressants or not prescribed antidepressants. And being a Saudi woman, I do not think is an easy thing. Understatement, and it varies depending on where you're from and who you are and everything else. But Ahmed is a very interesting example. So she, pictured here, is in her 80s, and she had never earned money in her life. And when we began, she created this line with a British designer called Vicky Sarge, and it was featured in Vogue Arabia. And she now runs a workshop, trains a group of women, and sells and has created her own line. So a woman in her 80s is now this entrepreneur, and she's so hungry for it. And you walk into our training area, the Mud House in Riyadh, she drags you in and she tells you everything she's doing. She shows you her new products. But this is what it looks like to do that as a Saudi woman, is for her in her 80s. I mean, the hunger is very real, but we need to make sure that we have a place that's appropriate for her to be working in. She's not going to have men working for her. It's got to be women with women. And then that, you know, that she also doesn't, you know, she's never used computers before. And so we've got to deal with digital literacy. But then there are young Saudis who have incredible design skills. So they have a very serious design market, I suppose, in Saudi Arabia. And so in Saudi, it is about, I think, supporting women in particular to be able to do this, supporting them in every way that they need, and making sure that the pieces that are being made are actually really up to scratch and respect the heritage.
Shoshana, wonderful. Elizabeth, thank you. April, thanks. Doug, let's give you a chance to ask Shoshana a question.
Shoshana, thank you, and thank you for sharing your fascinating, impactful story. For me, I suppose it sounds like you, to operate, need to rely on the support of government and local authorities in the areas that you're working. But as you said, in some of the countries you described, potentially with repressive regimes, or certainly regimes which don't respect human rights in perhaps the way that we take for granted. And I just wonder how you balance the need for support, but without sort of undermining your principles. And clearly, with that last example in Saudi Arabia, obviously you are empowering people in a way that may be alien to some of these societies.
Yeah, it's a really important part of this. I mean, if you look at my bank of 4 countries, they are debatably the countries with the international community has the least easy relationship. Not Jordan, certainly, but Syria and the Assad regime. So first of all, I spent a lot of time with governments. The country in which I lived was Afghanistan for about 5 years, but now my country directors and all my staff live in those countries. We only have a few people in Britain. And so I, spent probably 2 out of 5 days a week parked on ministry couches, just sofas, just trying to get various bits of random paperwork through. That's the sort of boring bit of working with local governments. The more important bit is about getting every government official you can down to the project to see it and believe it, because so many projects, in all of our countries, don't do what they say they're going to do, or waste money or steal money or whatever else. And so making sure that people actually believe, and this has been so true in Afghanistan, which is just the most progressed, but bringing a minister down, or a school group, or the mid-level bureaucrats who are looking to take a little bit of money off of you, you bring them down and they just get quiet and they look around and they say, this is like my grandfather's house, or I didn't even know this exists. Culture is within all of us. And I think the more difficult the situation is, the more you're in the middle of a conflict, actually that sense of beauty and hope and high standards is probably even more important. It's not a luxury. It's not a peripheral thing. It's central. It makes you feel like, yes, this is what we have. It's great. So there's an element too, I think, which is very positive, which is about making people really care about what you're doing. But your question was, I think, primarily about, how do we work in countries, how do we deal with the questions about supporting those countries. We are a charity whose mission is to preserve culture and support the people around it. And those are people. That's not about national boundaries. It's not about governments. And so I don't feel any difficulty working in these countries, because I'm not either working for the governments or against the governments. I'm working with that culture and those people, and I will work with the governments, and I will also do, and of course, in the case of Saudi Arabia, of course, and Afghanistan and many other places, we are working in a way that gives women a serious path to being businesswomen and serious professionals, in a way that is counter to some bits of that society or that government. Absolutely, we're doing that, but I don't pretend we're not doing it. I don't say what we are not, because I don't think it's helpful for our mission, is we're not a women's rights organization. We're not lobbying the government to change the way that they deal with these things. We want to preserve culture and make people's lives better through it. And I will lobby the government and spend a lot of time doing it about things that are more topical like that. And I think that that's the way that we deal with it. It's about people and culture and not about the governments.
Shoshana, thanks. In the few minutes, I think, remaining, April, did you have anything else you'd like to raise with Shoshana?
Shoshana, so is there another country that you have on your drawing board? Because I watched the progression of Myanmar and Saudi Arabia and so on, and some of this was, of course, instigated or by the Prince of Wales and his network. I think Prince of Wales was very effective in getting Islamic countries to support Turquoise Mountain in Afghanistan. And then some said, okay, we'd like that too. we'd like you to come here and do that, since we're talking about this. And I think that's how Saudi Arabia happened. Is that right? That was, they were originally funders of Afghanistan.
Yeah. Well, just one sort of Jeddah merchant family, the Jamils, and then Prince Al Walid bin Talal. So it was never actually much of it wasn't the Saudi royal family. But so in each of these cases, oddly, was a combination of the Prince of Wales and my visiting that place that happened at the same time. That's not coincidence. It's that when that doesn't happen, the country doesn't get started. But when I visit and he sees that leader and wants something to happen, it usually happens. So in the case of Saudi Arabia, I was trying to get more hotel commissions because the Mecca one had been so important for us. So I asked the British Council to bring me on a craft tour of Saudi. So I just bopped around Saudi Arabia, looking at all the different traditions, trying to pitch a collaboration where we could get our crafts into Saudi markets from Afghanistan. And simultaneous to that, Prince of Wales was seeing members of the family, the royal family, and they wanted this to happen. So there was born exactly what you're saying, April, which is they said, well, yeah, we'd like Turquoise Mountain. We'd like you to do it here. And I said, well, I'm not a contractor for hire. We have to really want to do this, and it has to be something that benefits our Afghan artisans and also is a tradition we really need to preserve. But I was so captivated by what I saw in the kingdom and also just how different it was than what I expected. So that's how that happened. And in the future, I've been asked and said no to a dozen other places that are all incredible, and I'd love to work in: Iran, Zanzibar, Yemen. But each one of these things, we're not, as you will have gathered, we're not a sort of, here's our model and you can franchise it, or we'll go and do it for a year and then leave. You know, every one of these things to me feels like kind of having birth to another child. And I have had two of them, so I don't say that lightly, but every time I set up a country program, I think I'm going to be there for a decade at least and invest in that place. And so I don't take it lightly. I think particularly given the state of the world right now and the fact that money is so difficult and that it's going to be so difficult to fundraise, I am not in expansionary mode, let me tell you that. But I will be again. And I think that around Jordan, that area is more than just Jordan, of course. We will work in Syria when we can. We will, and that won't be about working in Syria, not in Jordan. That'll be about working in both. I also think that Iraq is a place that connects to us culturally. The type of architecture we would be working with is important. So I think that Iraq and Syria and things around Jordan are probably the most natural places for expansion, but I will need to take a minute to do that.
Yes, exactly, yeah.
April, thank you. And Elizabeth, did you have a last question for Shoshana?
I guess the final question from me is, you've mentioned a few of the individuals that you've known, the twins that you've known since they were young, the individual craftsmen and artists. What for you is, from those personal stories, is there a lingering hope or dream from one of those individuals that hasn't yet been realized, that you hope in the next few years to see that dream or that hope come true?
Isn't that a lovely question? Not one I've been asked for before, actually. So I think that my deepest personal connection is with our Afghan artisans, because it's the place that I lived and where I spent so much time with them. And each of my country directors will have a different answer to this because they'll know an individual. I think that there are a group of jewelers in Afghanistan, women who graduated over the last 2 to 3 years, who have set up in jewelry. One of them's name is Masuda, another is Ramzia, and they have started a little collective. And, just as we were beginning to really expand sales, particularly into the US, of their jewelry, and they were designing their own collection. So you can look at our catalog of jewelry online. It's actually designed by us and them rather than other designers now. But then obviously coronavirus happens and sales become much more difficult. So I think for those people who were on the cusp of coming into their own and really breaking through that barrier, which is not an easy one, to get high quality Afghan crafts to American markets, as much as I sometimes try to make it seem like it's, oh, you just make it beautiful and you sell it and it's fine and New York loves it. I mean, it's a slog every step of the way, and things get stuck in customs and things just randomly disappear and all the rest. I feel like for those 3 women who had just started, they will be on pause, and I really, I look forward to seeing them thrive if they can be patient over the coming years.
Shona, thank you. And I think in concluding, what I would like to do is, first of all, tell people that they should go and look at www.turquoisemountain.org. That right, Shoshana? I think that's the right one, because this is the most remarkable story. You and your team are a force of nature. It's immensely encouraging in what is often a rather depressing world, particularly at this time of COVID-19, to see the way in which you have empowered people to take control of their artistic skills, use the masters to teach the apprentices. And it's one of the most exciting and interesting conversations we've had at the Institute. And I thank you so much, you and Rory, for what you're doing. And we're going to follow your progress with huge interest. And when it's possible to cross north of Hadrian's Wall and things open up again, we would love to bring you back to Scotland, where, as you say, the whole idea was started, and have you talk with the very many young people who aspire to do things and get involved with Asia and elsewhere in the future. So
thank you.
Thank you, and thank Doug for setting this up, and thank you very much, April and Elizabeth, for being on the call, and Shona again, thanks so much.
No, it's been wonderful. I loved speaking to you all, and thank you so much for the support over the years to you, Roddy and April. And it's so great to be back talking to Scotland.
A huge pleasure. Good. Thanks so much.